not gonna name them, I'm gonna do them. If you can't see, I encourage you to move your head or get up. I mean, there's no optimal place. I mean, I guess I can do this, but, okay. So, the name of the game is you try to verbally communicate the language of what you observe, okay? You ready?
Plantar flexion.
Left,
Plantar flexion.
ankle, plantar flexion, side joint motion, okay? What about this one? Right, subtalar joint,
Inversion.
inversion. What side moved? What joint are we analyzing? How did it move? How did it change position? Okay. All right, how about this one? Left, ankle,
Dorsal.
dorsiflexion, okay? How about this one? Start, finish. You heard that? Was that a landscape pop or a? You ready? What was that? We started here and we did this. Bilateral, both sides. Also acceptable would have been right and left. It means the same thing. What joint changed position? Subtalar joint, right? How did it change position? Eversion. You see the consensus here. What side are we analyzing? Right, left, or both? What joint are we analyzing? Ankle, subtalar, knee, hip. We analyze motion joint by joint. And then once you filter it down to there, then you say, well, how did it move? How did it change position? And then that's either plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion. So honestly, it seems like a lot of stuff, but when you process it, it doesn't have to be a lot of stuff. Even if something's moving crazy, that crazy motion is really made up of simple motions made by independent individuals. All right, how about this one? You ready? What did you observe? This is my start position. I do this.
Left knee extension, right knee flexion.
Do you see how just saying flexion, extension is not communicating it as well as we can? Okay? So what would be a better means of verbal communication for what you observe? Left. Well, left and right is cool, but it's if they did the same thing that avoids communication. Did they do the same thing? So then what we'll do is we'll just say, well, to avoid confusion, let's analyze what the left did, and then we'll analyze what the right did. Or we'll start by analyzing the right, or if they didn't do the same thing, then we need to communicate, well, who did what? Who went one way and who went the other way, right? So let's start with the left, because I am left-handed. Left, what joint were we analyzing? Knee. And what did the left knee do?
Extension.
Is that easy? Left knee extension. What about the right knee?
Deflection.
Right knee flexion. Yeah. So you see why we can't say both, because they didn't do the same thing. It's just hard. You know, you still have to separate them eventually, so you just soon leave off with separation. Okay. What about this one? Hips transverse plane. Remember how I said who owns the perspective of the transverse plane of the hip? Those ball and socket joints, man, they move so much. They have so much movement, degrees of freedom, they call it, that we have to say, hey, sagittal and frontal belong to the socket's perspective, and the transverse is owned by the long bone, the femur, the humerus, okay? So transverse plane perspective, what did you observe at the hip when I crossed my left leg over my right?
Left hip external rotation.
There you go. Now, I'm not disrespecting the fact that I might have flexed a little bit or I might have horizontally abducted, but I narrowed it down to say, hey, I just want to have this conversation from the femur's transverse plane, okay? That's how I funneled it down to what I would like for you to analyze. Pretty simple. Good. And remember I told you the temptation for internal, right? Because you see the foot coming in, it's very tempting to want to just leap and say internal rotation. But we have to remember, the motion has nothing to do with my foot. Nothing to do with it. That's just a distraction. The motion is happening up here. And when I cross my left leg over my right, it's because I had external rotation in my hip. Hip rotation has nothing to do with my knee. I could bring my knee back to anatomical position. Look at how I would have to rotate to go back home. I'd have to internally rotate to go back home, right? Don't pay attention to this involuntary shaking. External rotation, knee flexion gets me to the same position as if I was already flexed, and then I extend. Guys, if there's any questions or clarifications as we kind of do this review, this warm up, please let me know. Okay? All right. Let's do some trickier versions that were on the video. What about if I do something like this, pick up my phone, and I asked you what motion, I asked you to analyze potential motion in the hips. Now, don't assume, right? Remember the difference between assumptions and inference, right? Inference means you took everything into account, you used logic, you used context clues. Assumptions, you just jump into an answer because the bell rang and you wanted to salivate. So if I asked you to analyze motion at the hips, that does not mean there was motion at both hips. Right? 0 is a number. Check my bank account, right? Zero means something. So just because I ask you to analyze the motion in the hips, you can't come back to me and say, well, you said motion, so I assumed there was motion. I mean, there may be no motion. That's still motion. 0 velocity is still velocity. Your speedometer has a 0 on it as a measure of velocity. So if I asked you to analyze the motion at the hips, what would you say? How would we do that?
Right hip flexion.
Which hip flexed?
Right.
The right hip. Does everybody see that? Which hip extended?
None.
And I use this to reference anatomical position, right? It stayed put. It looks like it went out, but that's from a global reference. We analyze motion from a local reference. In other words, my left hip is still home. My left hip is still in its anatomical position. For me to have extension, I'd have to go beyond anatomical position. And I could. There's no rules that said I don't have to. But it's to show you that you can't just see motion or it's to show you the temptation of seeing something move and want to give credit to some type of joint motion, even though there may not have been some. I give this example all the time, that I can make my arm go up and not move my shoulder. I can lean my trunk, I can move my pelvis, I can move my hip, I can move my other hip. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to get your arm to look like it abducted when there may not be any motion there. Okay? So right hip flexion, left hip, in this case, none. Coming back up, right hip extension, left hip, nothing. Okay? Okay, what about this? Let's see. What's that? Right hip avaba when I went away from 6, and right hip when I went towards 6. Does anybody remember on the video, or for those of you that I know it could be, I'm sure some of you were like, man, it's 11 o'clock, I really need some sleep. Let me kick on Campbell's YouTube video and go straight to sleep. I feel it. My point is that do you remember why I teach it in terms of 6 o'clock and not just towards or away from the midline? Do you remember the biggest reason that I gave you for not teaching it that way?
Because your arm could go past.
Yeah. And your hips can do too, but if you use this global reference of a midline, it can get you into trouble when you get above. So in other words, if you keep it at 90 and below, life is great.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that once you go past 90, guess what? You're coming back to the midline. And for a lot of students, it's hard for them not to say, well, why isn't that adduction? You're coming back to the midline. And why isn't this abduction? You're going away from the midline. My point is that you don't have clockwise, and then once you get past 12, it's counterclockwise. It's the same direction of spin the whole time. So although that's convenient when you're in anatomical position, and it's just
it's not that it's just an easy way to teach it, but it can lead to some confusion. If you just say, well, abduction's away and abduction's toward, and you just keep it in this window, life is grand. But we are going to be analyzing, especially athletes, performers, activities of daily living. You're going to be analyzing a lot of things that aren't right in this little window. So we have to look at it for what it really is. The concept of going away from anatomical, but it's not a global reference. It's a local angular reference, meaning that midline is a linear concept. But angularly, up here, I am the furthest away from here as I can get angularly. Does that make sense? And technically, even if I went even further from an angle change, that's still further away than what I was here. Right? So it's the concept of going away the whole time or going back the whole time, not just some linear reference towards me. Okay? So that's really important. So, does anybody remember why I say silly things like and This is good stuff, man. This is checking for understanding. Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly why they sound so much alike. You know, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Yeah, they got the flexion the same, but right? But when you get to ab and adduction, they're so similar sounding that it's real easy to get those two confused, not because you don't know what they are, it's just don't really sound a lot. The analogy I gave in the video was my friends Heath and Keith, who were twins, looked absolutely nothing alike. But a lot of people mix their names because Heath and Keith, I mean, just sound so similar to each other, okay? So when you just say abduction and say adduction, especially with our South Louisiana accents that just kind of blend in, abduction, you know, you really have to emphasize, in my personal opinion, when you're studying a deduction, a deduction, just to make sure you don't miss it on the test just because it sounds simple. Okay, very good. So let's look at a similar, I think you guys got this concept down. So really all I'm doing is this, but here. It's really a very similar motion, but just in a different dimension. Here I was in my sagittal. This looked like it was moving, but it wasn't. This looked like it wasn't moving, and it was. So now all I'm going to do is go frontal and show you something similar. You see how tempting it is to give credit to the motion on what seems to be moving? But the motion actually happened here. Here's my pelvis. From the perspective of my pelvis, my right hip abducted. And then my right hip adducted. Right hip ab, right hip add, left hip I mean, I can move my left hip, but it would look something like this, right? But if I move both, this is what I was trying to say on the video. If you move both the clock, let's say I buy a brand new clock and it's in glass, it's not moving at all. If I move both the clock and the clock hand, it never leaves 6. Does that make sense? Even if I take it and spin it around. If I just took it and spin it around, that would like be me at a circus on the little thing where the dude's throwing knives and they spin you around. In other words, if the clock and the clock hand are spinning, there is no relative change in angles, there's no motion. Now, 6 o'clock could move because of the clock hand about the clock. But guess what? It could also move because the clock moving about the clock hand. That's when I said if I keep the needle here, I can move the clock and still have change. And that's what this is. Moving the clock about the clock hand still gives you those changes away from 6. Okay? So what was this motion? This was right hip, ab-ba-ba-ba-ba. One way that works for me, it may not work for you. I will strive to find something that works for you if you don't see it. It's always good to reference motion from the hips, and I'm going to teach you about the trunk from the perspective of the pelvis. The pelvis has a perspective. Every bone has a perspective. Remember, joints are an illusion. It's an articulation. It's a marriage between two bones, right? So you can look at perspective changes, bless you, from the perspective of the bone. Here I have a pelvis. It's made up of several bones, but those bones are either fused or barely movable. It's kind of like a cement slab that serves as a foundation, and we can build a skyscraper of a spine and these big, strong legs that we can move around our center of mass. So here's what I'm trying to tell you, is that if you're having a tough time seeing this, look at the pelvis as if it was in its anatomical position. Tilt your left head to your left shoulder. And look at the pelvis as if the pelvis was still straight up and down. And then notice how my right hip is abducted to it. You ready? Left ear, left shoulder. Look at the pelvis as if the pelvis was straight up and down. And notice how the right hip is abducted relative to it. Ready? Left ear, left shoulder. Look at the pelvis as if it was in anatomical position. Notice how the right hip is abducted relative to it. Yeah? Okay? Here's the harder illusions. What do we do when we've been standing for a long time? You know, let's say you're standing in line, or I don't know, guys. You tell me. I haven't been in college since the 90s. But do they still have like long lines to like do Cajun card or, I don't know, that was always USL back before it got changed to UL. I was here at USL. The joke was you stand in line. That was the running joke. So my point is that if you're standing in line for a long time, you'll probably start to do stuff like this. You know, shift weight on one leg, you know, take a break on the other, and then after a while you'll shift weight on the other leg. Take a break, right? Is there a natural shift weight? Well, what do you think's happening there? Right? You're having ab and adduction from different hip joints in order to shift weight on one side and then shift weight on the other side. So let's analyze it. Let's see if we can figure out which hip is doing what to help us shift weight as we're doing long periods of standing. Okay? So let's say I'm standing in line and getting bored, and I shift weight to my left leg. Now I'm going to help you out with this illusion. I'm going to keep my trunk, even though you wouldn't do this in real life. I need to teach you how the trunk kind of bends to help you keep eyes level and center of mass over your base support. But I'm going to keep the trunk in anatomical position to really accentuate the hip motion, okay? So I'm standing here, and then I'm going to shift my weight, put most of my weight on my left leg. My trunk is going to bend this way to help keep my eyes level and help keep my shoulders low. But if my trunk didn't bend, this is what it would look like. So once again, I'm going to ask you to go left ear, left shoulder, look at the pelvis from its anatomical position, and then you tell me right hip is above, and left hip is Yeah. Let's try it again from the middle, okay? Again, I'm not bending my trunk back so that you can better see what's happening at the hips. Left ear, left shoulder, right hip, left hip, And I said in the video, the whole 6 o'clock thing is just a reference to get you to see directions of spin. If this is the direction of spin for then this is the direction for even though I go past 6 in the other direction, right? It's the concept of add. Left hip, add. Right hip, add. Right hip, add. Left hip, add. It would look like this if I wanted to do it with my feet off the ground. It's kind of hard to do. But when your feet are on the ground, it's very easy to do. But they kind of have to do it together if your feet are both on the ground. Does that make sense? They kind of have to do opposite stuff if both feet are on the ground. Sagittal plane, they can do the same stuff. That's kind of important to know, right? I can have bilateral flexion, bilateral extension. But when my feet are on the ground and I'm going frontal, they kind of have to do opposite stuff. Locally, they kind of have to move in opposition. It's the same thing in the transverse plane. They have to move in opposition. They can't do the same thing. Because the same thing would require two different motions globally, but the same motions locally. And friction is kind of stopping that, so they have to do in opposition. Okay? Let's see, what else? Any of you? Any questions about hip stuff? Okay. Yes, sir.
Is there a way that you could show, like, would you still ask the same kind of question where one hip rotates and one rotates like sitting down? Like in the position you're in right now, could the same motion happen?
Oh, can they? Absolutely. If you cross your legs, the same motion happen. If you uncross your legs, the same motion happen. But if you want opposite motions to happen, it would look like this.
I meant adduction and abduction, not rotation. My bad.
No, it's okay. It's all good. If you're doing the same thing, it would look like this. And if you're doing opposite, it would look like this. But I mean, it's hard to do without moving your pelvis. But your legs, it would be like windshield wipers, right? They would have to do like this to go opposition, and this to do the same thing. It's like the doors. The same thing to the door would be to open and close. So if you want to do opposite, it would look like this. Right? One would open, one would close, one would open, one would close. So as one hip would, it'd be a lot easier if we imagine I'm hanging from a bar, right? Or like out of a Roman chair. As one hip abducted, the other hip would follow it and adduct. So they would have the same global rotation, just different local rotation. That's what it would be. But it's a great question, but it's hard for me to demonstrate because I don't have something to kind of fix my upper extremity to let my legs bilaterally dangle. I can dangle one leg, but when you dangle two legs, you either have to have something to hold on to, or you got to be very quick, and I'm neither. It's a good question. Any other questions, clarifications on the hips? Okay. All right. So let's review our upper extremity. What I taught. And it seems like it was a long time ago. And break it down. This is what you will be responsible for the upper extremity. Save scapular motion. I'm going to teach you scapular motion independently because it's a little different. It's all good. Okay? Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Scapula is a little bit of sledgehammer. But in terms of apple, banana, and strawberry, let's start off with sagittal plane functional motions, fetal out of fetal, right? So for the purposes of this class, I'm not going to have you learn things like distal interphalangeals, proximal interphalangeals, middle interphalangeals, MIP joints. That sounds like the dudes that fight the aliens, huh? Metacarpal phalangeals. You don't have a proximal and distal for the thumb, but you just have the first IP joint interphalangeal. The point is that for the purposes of this class, that itself can get overwhelming because you have so many. But let's stick to function. Flexion gets you into a ball, gets you to fetal. Extension gets you out. So we're going to talk about finger flexion and finger extension. And yeah, the metacarpal phalangeal can do some frontal plane stuff, some ab and adduction. But for the purposes of this class, I'm just going to ask you to follow the fingers. And we have finger flexion, which follows wrist flexion, which follows elbow flexion, which follows shoulder flexion. Okay? So there are your fingers, the articulation of all the phalanges and the metacarpals. Finger flexion, finger extension, finger flexion, finger extension. Here's the articulation of the wrist. Notice how these carpal bones are all about that radius. Think about, oh Brian, I have to pull up a picture, but in the Northeast, Vermont and Rhode Island, no, not Rhode Island, Rhode Island is super small. What's the one that hugs Vermont? New Hampshire? They do like an inverse thing where like one is thick at the top and it gets narrow at the bottom, bless you, bless you, bless you, and it gets thin at the bottom, and the other is thick at the bottom and it gets thin at the top. Right? I think that's how it works. That's how the radius and ulna kind of work. Notice how the radius, right, this is a left radius, the radius is more kind of thin, proximal, but then as it works distal, it's pretty thick. And it's thick because it's articulated with the carpal bones. Those carpal bones are all about the radius because when you flop the radius over the ulna, all those carpal bones have to go along for the ride. Ulna is real thick, proximal, because it's articulating with the humerus, but as it works its way down, it gets thin because it's not articulating with the carpal bones. Okay, it's kind of cool. So for us, the wrist joint, that ellipsoid, biaxial ellipsoid, flexion, extension, fetal, out of fetal. And the tricky part about the wrist is, again, this whole global local reference where if you just say flexion is when my fingers go forward, you're going to have problems because I'm going to pronate on you and do this and you're going to be like, oh, fingers forward, yee. Follow the fingers, man. That is the easiest clue. The easiest clue. So in other words, even if I'm supinated, follow the fingers. Finger flexion is going to lead you to wrist flexion. If I'm pronated, follow the fingers. Finger flexion is going to lead you to wrist flexion. Right? So if I'm pronated and I do this, and you say, whoa, 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 I'm not going to just follow, I'm not just going to assume. Let me follow the fingers, and the fingers will be, that was extension. Campbell trying to trick me. Follow the fingers. And again, that works because the wrist doesn't twist. So it keeps the same transverse perspective. Okay? So always follow the fingers to make sure that you know the difference between wrist flexion and extension, because you can be in a lot of different positions because of that dorn radial joint. Follow the fingers. So wrist flexion and extension in the sagittal, and then we have those two different forms of deviation, ulna and radial. The reason those are always true, once again, the wrist doesn't twist. So the pinky will always be ulna side. You can't get away from it. And the thumb will always be radial side. You can't get away from it. Okay? It would take some real crazy injury for that. And if you're like, oh my God, my thumb is pinky side, call a doctor. Some crazy stuff just happened to you. All right? So ulnar deviation is deviation of the digits, the hand, the middle finger, however you want to view it, towards the ulna. Radial deviation towards the thumb, radial side, ulna side. Okay? So again, I could do it in a lot of different positions that look different, but to the wrist, it's the same thing. Because when I do this, the eyes move with it. Its perspective moves with it. So again, do not learn, I'm pleading with you, do not learn these from like global reference. Don't just learn it from here. Don't just say, if I see the fingers go to the midline, like that's gonna get you. Because this is all the deviation. And guess what? This is all the deviation. And it has nothing to do with fingers going towards the midline unless I communicate that I stay in anatomical position. But on the test, I might be here, I might be here, I might be there, I might be here, right? I might be here. Okay? But the one thing that's the same for all of them is I went ulna side or I went radial side. I went pinky side, I went thumb side. That's true for any position you're in. Okay? So, how many motions do we account for at the wrist? 4. 1 for each horseman. 4. No wrestling fans? All right. Does hyperextension count as a separate motion at the wrist? Like flexion, hyperflexions? No, it's the same direction of motion. It's just you went a little too far than what your normal range of limits are. Does pronation and supination happen at the wrist? No. And again, it's easy to see why people would think so. You know, I mean, that looks wristy, you know. Right? But if this was happening, notice when I have wrist motion, I mean, I'm doing my best, but you don't see clothing move in my forearm. But when I do this, you see clothing move in my forearm. Why? Because that motion is happening in my forearm. Okay? All right. Let's get down to the elbow. How many motions can the elbow joint do? 2. Some of you are going to do this because you're going to give credit to this being an elbow motion. I'm not saying they don't live in the same apartment complex. That's the analogy I give. In other words, they live in the same capsule, but they don't live in the same apartment. They live by each other, but they don't live with each other. Radial ulnar joint is literally the concept of the radius wrapping and unwrapping about the ulna. And the reason you have it is to reposition your grip. That's it. It's so functional to reposition what makes us really unique as mammals. And that is this dexterity, work, function. Sometimes you need a grip like this, and sometimes you need a grip like this. Sometimes you need to work like this, sometimes you need to work like that. And the ability to just flip that sucker around is super cool. In addition, I hinted at last week how our radial ulnar joints help us keep our grip on things, right? Like when you're doing upright rows and pulling things, you utilize your radial ulnar joint. You wrap and unwrap. Because if you didn't, you'd be up here. So there's subtleness. There's beautiful subtleness to the radial ulnar joint motion, okay? But the concept is real simple. The radius is either going prone, pronation, right, face down, or going supine, going face up. That's it. It's either wrapping or unwrapping, okay? So this is what I'd like for you guys to do. Put out your arm on your desk and make sure your radius is unwrapped. It's in anatomical position, so your thumb needs to be lateral, right? And what I'd like for you to do is just a couple times, pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate. And notice how that thumb flips over to medial, right? Okay. Now I'd like for you to get your hand off the table. Now again, slowly, pronate, supinate. And just reposition it in all kinds of different ways. But keep telling yourself, pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate. I mean, go behind your back, go behind your head. But the concept of that, man, that's all it could do. It could either wrap or unwrap. That's it. Some of you are going like speed tests. That's all good. Different strokes for different folks. But I just want you to feel how, and listen, that wrap and unwrap, pronate, supinate, that's independent of your wrist movement because they're 2 separate joints. It may look different, but I'm either wrapping or unwrapping, wrapping or unwrapping, okay? So next we're going to do, start off in a supinated position, okay? Now flex your wrist. Wrap, unwrap, pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate, okay? Go back to anatomical position. Now extend the wrist. Pronate, supinate, pronate, supinate, right? To me, that's how you study. That's how you practice, is to literally just feel all the different scenarios you can have. And if you put your, okay, try this. Who are my lefties? Where are my lefties at, okay? All right, we'll start a club. Lefties, take your left hand, flex your elbow, if you can, take your left hand and put it underneath and wrap your fingers lateral. And what I'd like for you to do is pronate and supinate and just try to feel for that head of the radius. And literally, you can just feel it rolling like a clock. Righties, take your right hand, wrap it underneath lateral, make sure you cover a lot of surface area, and just pronate and supinate, and just try to feel for that radial head. Literally, that's all it's doing. It's just rolling like a clock. Don't go too much on the humerus. Stay on the ulna. Does anybody feel it? If anybody needs help, come hit me up after class. But just to show you the simplicity, that's all that's happening, guys. The radius is just like a clock. Now, this is a special clock. It has a stem that goes down, and as it rotates, it flips the body up. I gave the analogy about being on your pillow and wrapping your body around your partner. Your head stays in one place, but you could wrap your body around the other person. Hashtag spoon. And you can unwrap it. Guys, that's what's happening here. The head stays in the same position and it wraps and unwraps the body. And if you want to think of the thumb as kind of the foot, wrapping the foot around and unwrapping the foot around. But that's what's happening. When you're pronated, look, notice how they're parallel, right? When you pronate, you just wrap it. It's wrapped. That's what happens. Crisscross applesauce. And then when you supinate, you unwrap. So if I drew two little eyes, right, like supine position, if I do this, well then those eyes are now facing down, they're prone. Cool? That's it. That's all it does. It's a uniaxial joint. Now it's not a hinge because that one axis happens to be polar. So it's more pure rotation. It's a special, you know what it is? It's a revolving door. Y'all know those big fancy doors at those big fancy hotels that just spin like a carousel? Right? That's what this is. It's a revolving door. But that's all it does. Pronate supinate. Okay? I gave you a couple harder examples in class. And if you can't see it, that's okay. My job is to teach you to see the clues, to figure it out. What position am I starting in from my radial ulnar joints perspective? Is it in anatomical? This is anatomical. Okay? So what position am I in? I'm pronated, right? Remember, pronation is a motion, pronated is a position. So if I'm asking you for position, we want to add that ED on it, okay? And then I do this. And a majority of people, and again, it's not their fault. My job is to teach you these things, guys. A majority of people would say, well, there was no motion because I saw the back of your hand to start and I saw the back of your hand to finish. That's their logic, and that's sound logic. But the reality is I had to have radial ulnar joint motion, and I'll prove it to you by asking you these simple questions. Does the radial ulnar joint have anything to do with my elbow joint? No. So, does it have anything to do with my finger joints? So I can put my fingers back to anatomical. I didn't wrap or unwrap. I can move my elbow back to anatomical. I neither wrapped nor unwrapped. And then I can move my shoulder back to anatomical. I neither wrapped nor unwrapped. Am I in a new position? Yes. I started here. No. I started here and I ended here. I had to supinate. If I stayed pronated, this is what this row would look like. There's the magic. So the lesson here is that the radial ulnar joint works a lot with the shoulder. When the shoulder is trying to reposition stuff and you're trying to keep your grip under something or above something, that radial ulnar joint will work with the shoulder to allow you to maintain whatever type of grip you want on whatever type of object you want. I also use this analogy in last class, and that's what I'm reviewing, guys. Just kind of, dust the cobwebs off and make sure we're back on track. I gave this one. This is a tough one. Because again, globally, you want to say, well, that makes no sense. I see the palms up here and I see the palms up here. How in the world did I move my radial ulnar joint? And I'll say it's very simple. Supinated, pronated. That's how you moved your radioulnar joint. If you didn't, when you would put your hands above your head, you'd be here. And let me tell you how easy it is to see that. Put your hand out for a high five. Ugh. My hand went from facing forward. If I only flex and not move my radioulnar joint, guess what? My hand's going to be facing my back. Does that make sense? In other words, how do I keep my hand facing forward? Pronate. Now, of course, we don't do and then that, we do it at the same time. And that simultaneous angulation is what adds to the illusion. As my shoulder is trying to reposition my palm, I shall pronate to maintain my palm position. They happen at the same time. That's why it's hard to see. Subtleness of the radioulnar joint. Any first year class or introduction to movement class, look, it's great to do introductory motions. This is beyond that, man. I have to teach you these illusionary motions. I have to teach you these tougher to see kind of motions. I'll give you another example. Standing, not in anatomical position. I don't know who stands in anatomical position, but there's kind of this position which is called functional position, right? Where you're not supinated, but you're more either in a semi-pronated position or pronated position. So remember we talked about this. Why is it semi-pronated and not semi-supinated? Because the anatomical position is supinated, semi-pronated halfway. So let's say I'm in a semi-pronated position, meaning that I could either go here or there. I'm midway, halfway. National anthem comes on, and I put my hand over my arm. Now again, the illusion is, well, I must have just moved my elbow. And although you did move your elbow, that's the obvious, you moved your radioulnar joint. But it's subtle. It's subtle. Where did I start? Where did I finish? Guess where I finished? I'm in anatomical position. And unless I started in anatomical position, hey, what's up, man? How's your day? Yeah, it's going good? Okay. If all I did was flex my elbow, but it's subtle. It's subtle. And it happens at the same time as you're moving the elbow, and it's just not obvious. It's there, but it is not obvious. Okay? So the best way for me to show you how to see these things is before and after positions. Right? In other words, well, this is where I started, this is where I end. Let me go back to anatomical. I had to do this. I had to supinate. That's the best way, is you may not have observed you going from Lafayette to Lake Charles, but if you understand the concept of change in position, you can figure out that you had to travel west to get there. Okay? All right, guys, wait. Questions, clarifications. Baby shark, do. Questions, right side, anything? Middle side? All right, y'all have a great day.